Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Tuesday evening installment of the Present and Awesome Summit. I am really excited about this conversation. Hello, I'm Elissa Weinzimmer, the founder of Voice Body Connection and the host of this summit. And this is Danielle Kayembe, who is one of the most inspirational people I've ever had the opportunity to meet. And truly, Danielle is, I think the best way to describe Danielle is she's a female futurist, which I don't know that you necessarily came up with that title. Other people use it too, but you are the definition of a female futurist, and a women's economic specialist. So she's the founder of GreyFire and has, I could just keep going with your resume because there's so many different elements to what you do. So I'll let you say more about it. But welcome, Danielle. I am so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be able to have this conversation with you tonight. You and I have so many incredible talks, so I feel like we're just kind of letting everybody in on our best kept little secret.
So true. We're making it public now.
We are. We're letting everyone in.
We're letting everyone in. Welcome, everyone. So glad to have you. So I actually went back and forth a number of times about what to call this talk, because I was like, should it be presence and your like femininity, presence and your womanhood, presence and your female power? Like I think I texted you so many times, like, what do you think of this? What do you think of this one? And ultimately landed on presence and your power, because it's so completely what you're all about and embody is the concept of power. And certainly there's an aspect of being a woman or of femininity in it, but there's also an aspect that people of all genders can tap into in terms of what you are talking about and believe in. So why don't we start with, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be doing what you're doing in the world?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. So a little bit about myself. As you said, I'm the founder of GreyFire, and a lot of my early business career was in very traditional paths. I worked in investment banking and international consulting, and I consider myself a banking refugee, like many people. Some of the work that I started to do, I was working in Africa and advising on private equity, and I was seeing the impact of, mobile phone technology and telecommunications and how it was transforming the economies and communities in Africa in real time. And I was so inspired by this that I decided, I really want to figure out how to have an impact on society. How can investment have a greater impact? And I started to research all of the different areas. I said, I'm going to choose one area that I want to focus on. Maybe it's, water, clean water, or health, education. And no matter what I looked at, no matter what research I did, the answer was always, well, although there are all these problems, if you just empower women, that will fix the problem. And no matter what I read, the solution was always the same. If you empower women, these problems resolve. And so I said, why don't I just focus on empowering women instead of choosing one problem? And that just felt like the fastest way to make change in the world. And as focused as I was early on social impact, I quickly realized that it didn't motivate people to take action. But what did was making a clear case for the economic impact of women and the impact that women have on innovation. And once I was able to kind of join those two things, which really surprised me because I thought I'd escaped finance and economics and banking. But it was really once I brought those elements together, all the pieces of my path, that was what really created a lot of momentum. So I've been, I think kind of in my day-to-day, I have an advisory firm called GreyFire Impact, and we help to support female founders, especially underrepresented female founders. We help them scale their companies. We help them raise capital. And then I've also been speaking and doing a lot of content creation. And that's where I've seen so much engagement from people with ideas about the design gap, things like coded patriarchy, and also what I call women-centered innovation. So I've really been inspired by this new wave of female entrepreneurs, like the Jessica Albas of the world, the ladies that started Thinks, women that are creating innovation around the pain points that women experience in their daily lives. So that's been an incredible, an exciting part of my life for the last several months. And I've been bringing that message anywhere they'll have me. Literally anywhere they'll have me, and traveling as a speaker. I've just come back from Belgium and Morocco, as a matter of fact.
Sounds like a really exotic and lovely life. It's so cool.
Thank you. Wow. I'm loving it.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to loop back to a couple of the things you just mentioned in just a second, especially if you can dive into sort of talking a bit about coded patriarchy and women-centered innovation. But before we do that, since the topic of the summit is presence and then also intersecting with each individual interviewee's specialty, I'm curious, I've been asking all the people who are part of the summit to define presence. So, because I think it's kind of this nebulous thing. So what does presence mean to you, Danielle?
Wow. I think presence is being grounded and embodied in yourself.
I love that that's a hard stop, right? It's so simple. That's so beautiful. Yeah, great. Okay, so presence is being grounded and embodied in yourself. I love it. Say what
you know, I think that that's something a lot of times as women that can be difficult, because we learn what I call performative femininity, meaning that we're often we're behaving as ideals of what we've been taught a woman is, which is often nice and pliant and likable and perfect. There's not a lot of room for vulnerability or for authenticity. And when you're grounded in yourself, and you're able to embody that, you're able to be authentic, you're able to be available, you're able to be present in every moment, no matter what the interaction is. And I think it's a form of like very deep self-trust that I think you enter into with yourself.
I love that. And I really appreciate you using the word embody, because I constantly think about the fact, you know, as a voice and body coach, and of course you and I have had this conversation before, but I think a lot about the fact that that word is not part of our lexicon. We don't talk about the concept of embodiment or disembodiment very often. And yet we're living these very disembodied lives, where another way I would describe what you're talking about is we're following these scripts.
Yes.
As opposed to, truly checking in with what's my intuition, what's the deepest gut level of my truth in this situation and how I want to proceed. So, say what you're going to say.
I would absolutely agree with that. Yeah.
So let's use that opportunity of that idea to link us back to the coded patriarchy and the women-centered innovation idea. Can you talk to us a little bit about what coded patriarchy is?
Absolutely. So coded patriarchy is a way to explain the design gap that exists between men and women, and which is simply the idea that most of the world that we interact with has been designed with a male default. So as a woman, when you're walking through the world and you're interacting with anything from objects to cities to technology to even health or media, you are encountering points of friction all the time. And I call these pain points. And so some really simple examples that you encounter in every day are things like heavy doors. So I see, adult women having to use their full body weight to open revolving doors. And it's something that happens because doors are designed for the tensile strength of an average man. And the average man is usually defined as, 6 feet, 200 pounds. So if you're 5'4", 120 or 130 like me, the way you interact with those same objects is going to be very different. Another really simple daily example is cell phones. cell phones are actually designed for men to use one-handed and fit in their pockets. And because women's hands on average are about 2 centimeters smaller, our thumbs are a little bit shorter, we drop our cell phones more, we break them more. And as a result, women spend money acquiring rings and hooks and knobs to put on the back of their phones to make it easier to hold and carry and write. So these are things that when you ask a man will say, oh, I thought those were decorative. I've literally heard men say that. But, you know, as women, we're constantly shifting and kind of changing ourselves to fit to the environment. And the environment hasn't really been created in ways to make us comfortable. So one of the things that I follow and I talk about a lot is kind of this new wave of women-centered innovation. And these are companies that are founded by women that are creating products and services that really meet women's needs based on these pain points of friction that we're encountering all the time. So Honest Company, for example, really came from that insight about, you know, the worries that new moms have when they're buying products for their babies and getting their homes ready.
Oh, interesting. Honest, like the soaps and the stuff?
Correct. Yeah. So the diapers, the soaps, the cleaning products for the home and for the baby. And then Thinx, I'm sure as you know, makes underwear for menstruation, which is an incredible kind of innovation in both health tech, femtech, and fashion tech. And the thing I find fascinating about that is, as a experienced skier, a lot of these fabrics have existed for decades. You know, you have, you know, odor absorbent, sweat absorption, and all of those fabrics have been around. But it took a group of women to actually bring those fabrics together to serve a different purpose. So I find this whole wave of women who are creating products that disrupt, expand, or green existing categories really exciting.
Green is a really good point too. People coming in and saying, okay, we're going to make this sustainable. We're going to make this. Yeah, I've seen a lot of that, like the tampons.
Exactly. Exactly. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it, right?
And I've actually had the experience recently where I stand in the aisle. I was just up in Montreal, and of course, you know, I didn't bring my whole apartment with me. And so I'm there like, okay, now I have my cycle and I'm standing in the aisle going, God, it's only Playtex. That's like all I get. Like, okay. You know, so yeah, overshare, but also not overshare because I'm a woman, right? So
it's daily life, right?
Yeah, and that's actually even me having the reaction. Granted, I am an oversharer, as you know, but like me having the reaction of like, oh, I'm not supposed to talk about that. It's menstruation. Is, you know, that just right there shows the coded patriarchy of like what the conversations are that are okay and what aren't, right?
It's fascinating. I was actually thinking, you know, when you watch television and movies, you always have these scenes with a lot of like blood where the hero has been injured and like, right. And like the love interest or the woman like comes and makes a big show of like, you know, like tending to, right. And it's a huge, and there's blood everywhere and he's wincing through it. And it's always, you know, like his only weakness, right? But like something that's so normal for every woman, there's never any representation.
Well, okay, so this brings me to something that you actually posted about on Facebook and Instagram this week, which I noticed as well, which is that Instagram is it just Instagram has changed their regulations around birth photography and like what images are allowed to be shown. Do you want to say something?
Exactly. Yeah, so it's Instagram and Facebook that have agreed to finally change their policies around what is allowed to be shown. And the issue stems again from coded patriarchy and the male gaze. And so the fact that you have representations of female anatomy and the female body that when objectified don't create any issues in the algorithms that are designed by a lot of social media companies. But when women share their natural lived experiences in their bodies, so whether that's choosing to show breastfeeding or nipples or a live birth, that creates violations of, I think, like the ethics of, the community, usually like, it's a violation of their community standards. And I think the thing that's really interesting is that because there's such an erasure of the female perspective in media, women don't get accurate information about what birth and other natural female processes look like. So if you see movies, you see women laying on their backs, screaming and in a lot of pain.
In a hospital.
Yeah, in a hospital. Whereas if you watch a lot of these videos of natural live births, women are in much more comfortable positions. They're not in these clinical settings. They're surrounded by a lot of love and care, and they're going through a difficult process, but it's all, I think it's something that's a much more female-friendly image. And I think it's important for women to be able to see themselves through the eyes of other women, and to be able to see other real women breastfeeding and, interacting with their bodies, and to see ourselves expressed in ways that are natural and familiar, and not just objectified for clicks by men.
Okay, so this is all so great, and I'm on board, and just love. I mean, the first time I ever heard you talk about a lot of this stuff, which I believe was during a talk, because we met, in the context of both being female entrepreneurs, and you brought me into this community, Dreamers and Doers, that is so instrumental in so many ways. So I just, these thoughts blew my mind when I first came across them, and it really opened my thinking. So I'm so grateful to be giving it a platform to share with people. And I'm also curious, so to bring it back again to the present side of things, suppose I have two questions, and we can do them, in tandem or back to back. But one is, why is it so important to bring presence into this question of how women show up in the world, but also, and I think these are two separate questions, but I'll ask them at the same time. What about men listening? What can men do if this is really about presence and our power? Like, how do we use seeing and not being able to unsee all of this stuff to empower ourselves?
So I think for your first question, I think there's a certain type of bravery that empowers other people. And I think that for those of us that feel powerful enough to live and show up in ways that are embodied, we give permission to other people to step into that. And I think there are so many people that are ready, that just feel like they don't have permission, or it's not allowed yet. And they're waiting. And so when we take those steps, we are empowering the women around us. We are mirroring that behavior for other people. So I think it's important for that reason to always always show up, and always show up as your best self, and always show up as your authentic self.
I'll piggyback on that and say that you and I are sitting here going, permission granted, everyone listening. Permission granted. Like, you show up, be your best self, get on, Zoom with someone who you admire and have a conversation. Like, let's all be talking about this stuff and showing up fully. I love it.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to men, it's actually really important for men to go through the same process that women are going through. And I think that what we're seeing right now with just this rapid acceleration in the discussion about feminism in the mainstream, I think as women, we're exploring the impact that patriarchy has had on us as human beings. And not just as women, but I think as human beings, like whole, healthy, multidimensional human beings, and how difficult it's been to be that. And I think that men actually need to go through that process too, because they've also been limited in who they've been allowed to be and what they've been allowed to have. And so I think that it's actually time for men. I don't think that this is a conversation. In a way, it's not a conversation between men and women. I actually think it's a conversation that women are having as an exploration of self, and men need to start taking permission, giving each other permission to have as an exploration of self. And I think both men and women have to feel like they're allowed to be the best version of themselves. And I think that starts by understanding what this current structure has prevented them from being and experiencing as full, healthy human beings. And I think, just a lot of the emotional, limitations that have been placed on men. And I think men have also been asked to be very one-dimensional as well. And so I think it's both men and women stepping into that personal power in ways that are new. And I think that then allows, men and women to have the space to be vulnerable and have the space to show up and really meet each other in a place where you can start to have a conversation about equality.
I love it. I think I'd also be remiss not to ask you, in the context of this moment in history and time, about anything you want to say about the Me Too movement, or how that's moved us forward in this conversation, or whatever you want to say on that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's been so important. When I think around the time you and I met, it was just maybe about a year since Dreamers and Doers had started. And the founder of Dreamers and Doers, I think a few months after I met her, she was one of the first women to not only publicly speak about harassment in tech, but she was the first woman to actually name her harasser. And no one had ever had the courage to do that before. And it's one of the reasons I have always been so loyal to her and always been so loyal to the community that she's built, because I think it takes a certain self-sacrifice and integrity to be the first person to say they're going to step into the ring and do something like that. And I think that there have been so many women, both before her and after her, who have made incredible contributions to this conversation. Ellen Pao, obviously, so many women in technology, and then so many women now who are coming out in media and other professions and backgrounds, other movements around the world, in places like Argentina, in places like France, even in parts of Africa, women are now having these conversations. So I find it a really exciting time, because women are creating a space in society to talk about parts of their experience that have been largely invisible for so long. And, creating a space to really heal a lot of those problems and things that they've encountered. So I'm really inspired by the movement, and I think it's going to change how the next generations of women are treated and how they show up in the public sphere.
I venture to agree with you on that. I also Jim's chiming in, and Jim, thank you for this. So Jim says, I agree that each gender needs to have the conversation within their gender, but if they don't come back together and share what they've discovered, the walls and boundaries will remain. There has to come a point where gender-centric life becomes minimized. Any thoughts on that point?
Yeah, I think that we will eventually get to a gender-neutral space. I think the goal is to just be human beings. I don't feel like we need definitions, but I think we're still not there. I think it's great to say that we would love to have that, and I think it's ideal, obviously, but I also feel that realistically, if men wanted gender parity, they would have already been working for it.
Yeah.
And so I think they have to figure out why they haven't been involved, or why it took Me Too for them to have an awareness And I think that that's a real question that deserves exploration. So I don't think that women should wait for men. I think that, you know, everyone that's involved kind of has their own work to do. And I think these processes feel messy to people, and it's an uncomfortable space to be in. And we're not used to that. We're not used to being in a space that feels undefined. And so I understand that people want to get there already, but the problem is that the solutions that people are creating are still from a space that is steeped in inequality.
Yeah.
And you have to decolonize your mind before you can start to really have a conversation about what parity looks like.
Decolonize is a beautiful way of saying it. I haven't ever heard it said that way. The thing that's coming up for me is, so I was talking to Kelly Wagner in the interview earlier today, and in the conversation about race, there's a stage, and I feel like there was a stage both in terms of the race conversation, at least in the United States, but also that people tend to go through as they start to navigate that conversation, where people will be tempted to say, oh, I'm colorblind, right? Mm-hmm. And that's like the place from which all lives matter stems, as opposed to mm-hmm. allowing for Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. And, so for instance, in the How to Have Presence course, in the way that I'm talking about things, I talk first about awareness, and I feel like it applies here. Like, we have to pull back and shine a light on what's been happening and name the disparity and we have to be able to say, women are experiencing this, men are experiencing this as a whole, right? Generalizing a little bit, and then also, of course, going into individual experiences. We have to be able to say the Black community is experiencing this, the white community is experiencing this. Like, we have to be able to actually use our terminology to distinguish before we can then come back together. Does that feel like something true for you?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a process and there's stages to it. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot of the work starts within each separate community, because I think that the type of work that women have to do is very difficult to do with men present. Yeah. So even when one man is present, it changes the way that women behave, because we're so socially conditioned to perform femininity for men. Yeah. So when men are interacting with women, they're not really getting the truth. So I think that that's something that men just don't realize, right? And so so the work that women have to undo is that conditioning. Mm-hmm. And I think that for men, there's a couple of studies. I think there's like the Future of Men Project, and then another group I know, ORF, and they did some research, and I think the Future of Men Project said that something like 60% or more of men's interactions involve some type of like demeaning language about women. And so it might not be that they're directly insulting a woman. It could just be that even like the type of language that they're using or the type of slurs they use against each other involves some type of put down for women. And then there's a study that something like, I think it's like 60 to 70% of the interactions that men have with like voice chats and AI, so the Alexas and Siris of the world that are female, also involve like demeaning and like harassing language. And so much of the behavior that's happening with men is happening in spaces that women don't have access to. And it's being normalized by behavior with other men. So yeah. It's not that women need to tell men, hey, don't do this. It's actually that men need to tell other men this isn't okay, because they're the ones setting the norms for each other. So those are the spaces where we need men to be doing the work, which is, again, why I was saying earlier, when we talk about like male allies and we talk about men and women working together, I feel like if men were already doing the work, we would be much further along.
Yeah, it's interesting. And Jim, I want to acknowledge what you typed into the chat box about saying men have not had the conversation as a large generalization. And I think that's what we're speaking to right now is, of course, I think you would say, Danielle, that some of the men are doing the work, but largely as a whole, we are making some generalizations right now in order to look at, you know, what's happening across the board. Do you want to, many men have true, you say, Jim, but many haven't. But to lump all men into a single category is as troublesome as lumping all women together as having the same set of standards and goals. Fair.
Well, I don't know how you could argue because there's no proof of the point that it's a generalization. Like the world that we live in is pretty much proof that it's not a generalization.
I mean, it's difficult for us to move forward. It's difficult for us to move forward without having a conversation about trends, right? And without saying, this is what we're seeing happening. And of course, we're going to witness different things on an individual level than on a collective level. But I at least feel that you're speaking to something that is happening in the collective.
Yeah. And it's, you know, realistically, I understand if this is something that doesn't feel true for men, but the reality is this is women's lived experience, and you're going to have to learn to make space for that and take it as valid as well. So it's not something that I can't argue with you about it because it's the reality of women's lived experience, and you have to take that as truth and then decide how you're going to move on from there in a way that's constructive. So there's really not anything to debate.
Mm-hmm. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to let us go a little bit over right now because I think the conversation is really fascinating. But in the interest of time, I want to bring us back to something that you said about personal power, which is, you know, how when we are, you know, working together as women or working together as men, and you talked about developing our personal power within those dynamics so that we can then come back together. What are some of your personal tools and techniques for developing personal power? What would you recommend, or what works for you?
Wow. That's been a huge journey. I don't know if there's any one single technique.
As I ask you this question, I know, like,
yeah.
How long does everyone have? Do you guys want to be on the line?
Yeah. Yeah. I you know, so for me, I think, there was there's a moment for me that was very clear and conscious when I made a choice to really start engaging with my femininity and to start honoring and celebrating it. And that was just like a clear kind of almost like bolt out of the blue moment where I realized that I'm a woman in my 30s and I hadn't really been taught to appreciate my femininity. And waking up to that was very difficult. And then it felt very, what's the word? It just felt like something that I needed to like start to immerse myself in right away. So
like you were compelled in a good way.
I was compelled. I was compelled. And, you know, I think that everyone's journey is going to be different. But I think for me, one of the things that really shifted was that I started to spend a lot of time in spaces with other women. And whether that was joining groups like Dreamers and Doers, being active in networks of women, you know, actively supporting other women professionally, starting to kind of learn more about myself in terms of like health, and spending time around women in like new moon groups and full moon groups, and really just that whole range of the feminine experience, I think has given me a perspective that I didn't have a few years ago. I feel like I have a much more rich idea of how other women embody different parts of their femininity. And that has been mind-blowing for me, to realize that there's no rules. And there are women inhabiting their femininity and every aspect of their femininity and building the life that fits them in ways that are different. And so it's made me feel less constrained and much more confident, because I feel like I'm surrounded by so many models that resonate with me. And I'm able to pick and choose the pieces that work for me and what doesn't. And so I think that that's contributed to me feeling much more grounded. And I'm able to have spaces where I can be vulnerable, where I can ask questions, where I can learn, and where I'm among a trusted group of women. And so I think that that's, those are some of the things that for me have been really transformational. And obviously everyone's path is different, but I think for me, intentionally building networks of women that support me has made all the difference.
So I think that brings me to, because I know personally when I got a good dose of Danielle when I first met you, I was like, more of that, please.
Same.
Thanks.
Same.
Thank you. So if people want to learn more from you, if they want to follow you, what's a good way to sort of hop on the Danielle train and stay with you?
Sure. So I am pretty active on social media. I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram, also on Twitter. So I think you just find my name on any of those platforms and follow along. Yeah.
Great. And also we can link to the article that you published. Was it in the fall now? Has it been?
Yep. Yeah, it was published in the fall and then republished by Refinery 29 in the winter. Mm-hmm. So I'm happy to share that. And then my website is daniellekayembe.com.
Fabulous. I will put all of it in the newsletter for tomorrow. And if you want a deeper dive into Danielle's, really lays out a beautiful view of the coded patriarchy and the female-centered innovation stuff in this article about the female economy. So
thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for being here with me in this conversation. I hope that we get to do more things like this in the future and keep shouting it from the rooftops and flying to Morocco and all the places and speaking to anyone who will hear you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for sharing this course. I got so much value out of it. I do a lot of speaking. So there was just so much incredible content that I found helpful. So thank you. I hope anyone that's an entrepreneur or who is having to pitch or raise money or do a presentation for work finds this content and uses it. I think there's just so many gems in there. So thank you again.
You're welcome. And I'll just actually situate what you just said, since I haven't really talked much about the course yet in the summit. But Danielle's talking about the How to Have Presence course, and I'm doing a live round of it, which starts next Tuesday. So for those of you that have been tuning into the summit, keep getting the emails, and I'll share with you at the relevant time more information about the course. And classes open next Tuesday to audit. So if you want to try the first week for free, I'm really, this is information. The stuff that I study about presence that I've been talking to you about for a long time, it's coming through me, and I'm sharing it through what's worked for me and what's blown my mind over the course of time. Because when we understand how to become more present, when we understand how to put ourselves in the circumstances that you're talking about that help us ground in ourselves and become more present and transform our nervous system, transform our fluid bodies, if you will, as women, etc. It's really powerful. It makes a big difference in our ability to show up and have these conversations and share our message in the world. So,
absolutely, it does. Absolutely. So, thank you again, and thank you for having me. This was such a wonderful talk.
Yay! Thank you. Okay, bye everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in, and see you for the next Present and Awesome Summit interview tomorrow. Take care.